Our next speaker is here to teach us about an efficient and an orderly way to conduct meetings. He has served on the board of directors himself and is a big fan of less chaos, me too, and more order. Please welcome Jim McLaughlin.
Thank you, Madam Toastmaster, and good morning, fellow Toastmasters. It's good to be with you all today. You know, today people are, I won't say consumed, but some of us are consumed by meetings. Executives and managers often spend up to 50 to 75% of their time engaged in meetings. And even if you're not at that level, you may spend time in civic organizations or associations that are run, hopefully, in somewhat of an orderly fashion, and there's not too much chaos. Now, whenever people get together to discuss issues and make things happen, there's an opportunity for conflict to arise. And to get to a successful and meaningful and powerful resolution, there needs to be some rules, there needs to be some procedures in place. It's really helpful to have some procedures so that the meetings conducted in an orderly manner, and that everybody feels as though they're heard and they're treated fairly, and that their opinions are heard and that they matter. So that's why parliamentary procedures were developed to, as it says here, to take into account the often conflicting interests that people have and get to a successful resolution. Parliamentary procedures are based upon the following general principles. So the votes of all members count, nobody votes twice, and nobody's vote is more important than anybody else's vote. It's evenly spread across the board. Members who are absent and members who have an opinion that differs are treated fairly. They have rights. All members have the right to free and fair debate and to know the meaning of what is being put before them, to understand what it is that's being proposed and what the impacts of that motion might be. The majority has the right to decide. Majority rules, remember that? Probably learned that in childhood, right? Majority rules. And that the minority has the right to be protected and to speak. Everybody's treated fairly. Parliamentary procedure facilitates the interaction of business and allows fairness to be in play. Anybody been in a situation where that really hasn't happened quite like the way you want it to? Right? Because they're not really, people's egos take over sometimes, and that's chaos, order. Because when people get together, great things happen. You get that vision, let's go there, let's make that happen. But everybody doesn't always agree on the best way to get there, right? So during each of the next 5 sessions, I'll be presenting in this format, 15 minutes at a time, what Robert's Rules of Order is all about. I gave away the Roberts part. I'll tell you what that means in just a moment. But we'll talk about the basic principles, about the motions, about the rules governing how these decisions are made, and different methods of voting in a meeting, and we'll do a little practice and participation if we have time at the end of each session. That's part of it. So the procedures we're going to discuss, there's 2 roles involved in a meeting. There's the presiding officer, person you might say running the meeting or facilitating the meeting, and then there's the member. So in this, it looks something like this. There would be the presiding officer. We saw it earlier when Robert was the presiding officer. It's not always the president. The president might not be here. It might be somebody else. The term is presiding officer, running the meeting. And then the members. There's those two roles. The presiding officer understands how the rules work, how to conduct the meeting. And the member, it's important for them to know how to engage, how to make a motion, and how those procedures work, and what their rights are. So now, what is this Roberts thing? Anybody not heard of Robert's Rules of Order? Is that a brand new term? Okay, good. It's sort of out there, but a lot of people, who's read the book? Wow. Okay, well, of course, the DTMs. No, I didn't see Ed back there raise his hand. Let's see. So it all started, for centuries, legislative bodies have been putting things together and creating rules of how to operate. But it was about 150 years ago, General Henry M. Roberts it was after the Civil War, and he was stationed at various places around the country. He was moved around, and he was a very civic-minded person. He went to groups and meetings and fraternal organizations and churches and liked to be involved in the community. And he noticed there was a real lack of consistency in how all of these meetings were run. And so one year, 1876, he was stationed in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for the winter. We're cold and dark, right? We didn't see much of that last week. We saw the beautiful springtime. But there he was, long cold winter. He said, I'm going to put a book together. And he created this manual of rules of order. And it became Robert's Rules of Order. In the current version is Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised 10th edition, if this book is up to date. It's the current, or so I'm told, I guess he's a way to put that. And it's probably the most universally accepted. There are other rules of order, but they're all very, very similar to this. I don't know why people would choose something else, but they probably have their reasons. It's part of their constitution. So speaking of that, I'm going to give you some basic definitions now that we're going to use. One is a quorum. So a quorum is how many members need to be present for us to conduct business. We deal with this in our executive committee meeting, right? There has to be whatever the Constitution says is that number. It's typically more than half, or a half plus one, or it could be 2/3. It depends on the organization. That's a quorum. There has to be a certain minimum number of people in attendance to do business. That means, if you're going to allocate money for something or change a rule, you can get together and talk, of course, but you can't conduct any business. The next item is Constitution. So that's a document that states what the organization is about. It's the structure of the organization. And then we have bylaws. Now these two terms have become kind of, over the years, and I understand this is addressed in a new version of Robert's Rules of Order, sometimes the bylaws are the primary document. The Constitution is becoming less important. But just think of it as the Constitution is the basic structure, and then the bylaws are sort of how we're going to go about doing that. The bylaws can be amended and adapted more easily than the Constitution. For example, we wouldn't change what our club does. It's about public speaking and leadership. That's part of the Constitution. How we go about doing that, we might alter in a different way. And then there are standing rules. Now again, this is something that's a little further down the hierarchy, things that you might change more frequently. They might take, whereas the bylaws might take a 2/3 majority to change, the standing rules might just take a majority vote. And then we have main motions. This is what we'll be talking about, or a motion. So this is a proposal to change the way we do something or do something new that we haven't been doing before. And we'll get into some examples of those. And then we have, of course, the presiding officer. Yes, the presiding officer is a member who conducts the meeting and sees that everything is happening according to these rules, because sometimes there's an unruly member out there, right? Okay, so let's now talk about how to handle a motion. There are 6 steps in handling what they call here a main motion, primary motion. There's different kinds of motions, and as you proceed through this course that we're going to be doing over the next 5 meetings, you'll learn about other kinds of motions as well, but we're going to talk about the main motion here. There are 6 steps involved in that process. One is a member makes a motion. You may have heard somebody say, I move that we, you may have seen it on TV if you haven't actually been in a meeting. So somebody makes a motion. Somebody seconds that motion. Actually, let me back. Well, I'm going to go into these in more detail, so I'll just provide them at a high level, and then we'll drill down. Another member seconds the motion. I second that. You might have heard that before. Then the discussion can ensue once the presiding officer places the motion before the group. Okay, so somebody makes a motion, somebody seconds the motion, and then the presiding officer takes the next step in that. And then the motion is open up for debate. Anybody have any discussion about that? Then we have, motion is put to a vote. Let's vote on it. Now, the closest thing we do this as a club is when we have a new member, right? This is when we have discussion and debate, and boy, sometimes it gets ugly. I'm just kidding. Sometimes I wish it would, just to mix it up. But And then the presiding officer announces the result. And this is you probably are familiar with this kind of thing. But there's some details here that you may not have known about, some details that I didn't know about once I started studying this. Let's drill down again a little bit further into it. So the first thing that happens is that somebody raises their hand, or in some meetings they stand up. There's some way to get the presiding officer's attention. The presiding officer then recognizes the person. Yes, Esther, I'm not going to ask you to do it now, but whoever raised their hand, yes, do you have something to say? I propose a motion. That's the second part of it, is that somebody stands, and as long as there's no other business going on, so this is important. If there's a motion on the floor, you can't bring up another motion. There's an amendment that could be made, but that will be later. So a person stands up, raises their hand, and by some way gets the attention, and then the chair, the presiding officer, recognizes that person. They state what business they want to conduct, what motion, what initiative or proposal they have for the group, and then somebody else just shouts out or states, I'd like to second that motion. The presiding officer does not need to recognize or call on the person that seconds the motion. The person just seconds it. Why is that important? Because if only one person wants to talk about that issue, only one, and sometimes it may be an issue, and one of those unruly people, they keep bringing the same issue up over and over again. I think we should paint the building green. If nobody's going to second that motion, then we're not going to have a discussion about it. And that is a good thing, because you don't want, if it's not if more than two people, or if two people don't want to discuss it, then we're not going to discuss it, okay? So I found that to be very useful. So that's the purpose of seconding a motion. And then the next part is the presiding officer then states the motion. And the ownership of that motion sort of transfers from the person who made it to the entire body itself. It now becomes sort of the property of the entire group. The president then states the motion, and this is another new thing for me, and then calls on the person to make the motion to argue in favor of the motion. That's the primary way of doing it. And then asks if there's anybody who has a differing opinion. Isn't that great? Sometimes you're in a discussion, everybody's talking for it. Well, if there's nobody talking against it, let's just get to the chase here. Get to the point, cut to the chase. Extol the motion that's being made. So if there's no other side, and then another part of that is everybody gets to speak first before anybody gets to speak twice. How's that? And so the person who makes the motion gets the first opportunity to speak. The presiding officer asks for anybody on the contrary to that. Right? Nobody? Okay, well, let's invite that new member to be part of our club. Might be the format we have in that. And then it's a back and forth. Pro and con, pro and con. Doesn't that sound orderly? Have you seen that happen? To some degree, right? I mean, there's like a spectrum of how actually. So this is why it's important for the presiding officer to know how this works, and as well as the members, so they can interrupt and say, "Wait a minute, we got off topic here." Right? That's another thing that can happen. Is you should probably notice, and that's chaotic. People get off topic. All right, let's see what else needs to happen. Once the discussion is complete, then the presiding officer says, well, let's take a vote. Are we ready for a vote? So it's like the last call. Are you ready for a vote? And then we take the vote. And the vote can be done in various ways. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All against?
No. Nay.
Okay, well, that was pretty close, so I'm not really sure. Let's do it by raising hands. How many are in favor? Okay, then you would count them, right? And how many are opposed? And then you would count those. And you might also say, are there any abstentions? Does anybody abstain from voting? Now, I might abstain if I have a personal interest in the outcome, to be fair. I also might abstain, so sometimes in meetings they'll approve the minutes of the last meeting. Well, if I wasn't at that last meeting, I'm going to abstain, because how can I approve the minutes if I wasn't even there? Right? So I would abstain from that vote. Another interesting fact that I found was, what happens in the case of a tie? What happens in the case of, well, the president doesn't vote unless it can affect the outcome. There's two scenarios that can happen. It's a tie, and if it's a tie, the vote is defeated. By definition, it's defeated. So the president can then vote if he wants it to pass, or do nothing if he wants it to be defeated. Another scenario, what if it's 8 votes for and 7 votes against? Well, if he wants it to pass, he'll do nothing, but if he wants it to be defeated, he can vote against it, and then it's a tie, and then it gets defeated. So the president only votes if it can affect the outcome. Interesting, isn't it? Yes. And then, what else do we got? Push the vote. The presiding officer then announces the vote, and then talks about what's the next step. What actions should be taken to implement that? Who's in charge of that? Who's going to take that on? Sort of the planning part of that motion. All right, that's pretty simple, right? We're probably mostly familiar with that. But there's little nuances in there that I certainly learned, and hopefully you did. Hopefully you did too. Remember that the presiding officer only votes if it's going to affect the outcome of the vote, and can abstain, and anybody can abstain anytime. I think I mentioned that. Well, as I'm running out of time here, I'm going to wrap up with just think for yourself about when we vote in new members and how we might use that as an opportunity to kind of practice this, understand that, and also in the officers committee. So next week, I'll be going into step 2 of our phase 2 of this process. Toastmaster. Thank you for your attention.